The 9,552nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel, Qatar, and Tunisia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them Document S/2024/173, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Algeria. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to extend my sincere appreciation for your efforts in convening this meeting to deliberate and take action on the draft resolution S 2024-173. The draft resolution under consideration is the culmination of extensive discussions among Council members. As the primary custodian of international peace and security, the Security Council cannot afford passivity in face of the call for a ceasefire in Gaza. By presenting this text, our intention is to empower the Council to fulfill its mandate and protect lives, commencing with an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Ample time have been afforded for Council members to deliberate on the content of the text. Our approach involved meticulous consideration of received proposal and amendment, resulting in what we believe is a balanced text, capable of garnering broad support. The draft resolution underscores key elements, including 1. A humanitarian ceasefire. Second, unhindered aid delivery to all parts of the Gaza Strip. Third, rejection of forced displacement of Palestinians. 4, compliance with provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. And fifth and last, the imperative for all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. Madam President, throughout this process, we have heard calls to give time to a parallel track. in order to preserve its chances, with concern raised that any action from the Council would jeopardize this effort. However, almost 1 month after the ICG orders, signs of hope are still absent for improvement of the situation in Gaza. Silence. Silence, we contend, is not a viable option. Now is the time for action and the time for truth. Madam President, members of the Security Council bear the responsibility of voting in favor of measures that uphold international peace and security. This resolution is a stance for truth and humanity, standing against the advocates for murder and hatred. A vote in favor of this draft resolution is a support to the Palestinians' right to life. Conversely, voting against it implies an endorsement of the brutal violence and collective punishment inflicted upon them. A positive vote for the draft brings hope for hundreds of thousands of children to return to school and enjoy their right to education. Conversely, voting against the draft resolution is a vote in favor of annihilating their dream for a better life. A vote in favor of the draft resolution stands in solidarity with the right of Palestinian women, while opposing it means to accept degrading practices that destroy their dignity. Furthermore, supporting the draft resolution means endorsing the Palestinian right to food. Rejecting it constitutes, however, an approval of starvation as means of war against hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. A vote in favor of the draft is a defense of the right to health, while voting against it is an approval of violation of hospital sanctity and an announced death of those who escaped it in the first place. Madam President, the Council must not merely call for a ceasefire. It must ensure steadfast adherence by all parties. The international community must act swiftly, as the value of ceasefire diminishes with each passing moment. We are rapidly approaching a critical juncture where the call to halt the machinery of violence will lose its significance. Today, every Palestinian is a target for death, extermination, and genocide. We should ask ourselves how many innocent lives must be sacrificed before the Council deems it necessary to call for a ceasefire. For us, and I hope for all the security members, I hope for all the Security Council members, Palestinians, Palestinian lives matter. Each one of us decide where to stand in this tragic chapter of history. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Colleagues, for months, the United States has tirelessly pushed toward a goal that all of us should aspire to: a sustainable resolution of the Gaza conflict so that Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side and enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. To build towards that future, the United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, along with Egypt and Qatar. This hostage deal would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks, and from there, we could take the time to build a more enduring peace. President Biden has had multiple calls in recent days with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as the leaders of Egypt and Qatar, to push this deal forward. And though gaps remain, the key elements are on the table so that if an arrangement is reached, it would help create the conditions for sustainable cessation of hostilities, which I know all of us would like to see. Of course, we want this deal to happen as soon as possible, as is shown by our exhaustive efforts. But sometimes hard diplomacy takes more time than any of us might like. Believe me, I understand the desire for the Council to act urgently, to positively shape the situation in line with the Security Council's mandate. Still, that desire cannot blind us to the reality of the situation on the ground. It cannot come at the expense of undermining the only, and let me repeat, the only path available toward a longer, durable peace. And that is why you've heard me say over and over again, any action this Council takes right now should help, not hinder, these sensitive and ongoing negotiations. And we believe that the resolution on the table right now would, in fact, negatively impact those negotiations. Demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire without an agreement requiring Hamas to release the hostages will not bring about a durable peace. Instead, it could extend the fighting between Hamas and Israel, extend the hostages' time in captivity, an experience described by former hostages as hell, and extend the dire humanitarian crisis Palestinians are facing in Gaza. None of us want that. And so I reiterate the United States' belief that while numerous parties engage in sensitive negotiations, this is not the time for this resolution, which jeopardizes these efforts. Colleagues, I communicated our concerns publicly and privately over the last several weeks. We've submitted numerous rounds of edits. All were ignored. And so for that reason, the United States has offered an alternative resolution that would do what this text does not: pressure Hamas to take the hostage deal that is on the table and help secure a pause that allows humanitarian assistance to reach Palestinian civilians in desperate need. Again, there's much more we all agree on, and the alternative resolution put forward by the United States is rooted in those shared beliefs. To start, in line with President Biden's comments last week, our text calls for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released. Last I checked, no one here opposes this. A majority of us also agree that it's time for this council to condemn Hamas. We know because you provided that feedback to Russia on its PRST and to Algeria on its resolution, a feedback that was inexplicably ignored. Should the U.S. resolution be adopted, it would be the first to condemn Hamas for the abhorrent attacks of October 7th, including the sexual violence documented that day. The U.S. text also makes clear that Hamas has no place in future governance of Gaza, nor does Hamas represent the dignity or self-determination of the Palestinian people. Again, all things I believe we agree on. In addition, our draft states there can be no reduction of territory in the Gaza Strip and rejects, as we have before in Resolution 2720, any forced displacements of civilians in Gaza. It also highlights the concerns many council members have regarding the fate of civilians in Rafah, making clear that under current circumstances, a major ground offensive into Rafah should not proceed. Colleagues, this is not, as some members have claimed, an American effort to cover for an imminent ground incursion. Rather, it is a sincere statement of our concern for the 1.5 million civilians who've sought refuge in Rafah. Civilians must be protected and have access to humanitarian assistance and basic services. On that note, our text outlines a path for implementation of Resolution 2712 and 2720, including provisions that call for the expansion of aid at scale. It also further clarifies and strengthens the mandate of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, whose plan I know we all support. As in previous resolutions, it places an emphasis on the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and it calls for lifting all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance, opening additional humanitarian routes, and keeping current border crossings open. Our draft also aims to support the Secretary General's effort to investigate those UNRWA personnel who directly participated in October 7th, and it supports the work of the independent review group led by Catherine Colonna, focused on ensuring UNRWA's neutrality. These and other steps are necessary to restore donor confidence. Finally, and as always, the draft reiterates our unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace, within secure and recognized borders, under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. Colleagues, this resolution reflects the many ideas that have been shared over the past month, but which are not reflected in the text before us today. And we believe it will both support the ongoing negotiations and lay the groundwork for a sustainable peace in the region. But in addition to getting the what of this text correct, we also know it's critical to get the how and when of it right, too. We will work in earnest in negotiating this text, and indeed intend to leave time for everyone to comment rather than impose an arbitrary deadline for the vote. Colleagues, we're at a pivotal moment and a critical one. Critical for the hostages who've been held captive for nearly 20 weeks in Gaza, and critical for their families who are desperate to be reunited with their loved ones. Critical for Palestinians whose homes and families have been destroyed and who now wonder where they'll find their next meal. Critical for Israelis, many of whom are still displaced or face barrages of rocket fire. Critical for Palestinian civilians in the West Bank who are at heightened risk of extremist settler violence. Critical for humanitarian workers and journalists who put their lives on the line every day to do their jobs. And critical to everyone who desperately want to see sustainable peace in this region. That includes, I believe, every single person in this room. And so let us commit to doing this the right way and at the right time so that we can create the right conditions for a safer, more peaceful future. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
вот уже пятый месяц
for the
в
fifth
Газе
month now
разворачивается
in Gaza, an
беспрецедентное насилие, масштабы
unprecedented violence
которого
has been
превзошли
unleashed in
любые
Gaza, the magnitude
конфликты,
of
с
which
которыми
has surpassed
человечество
any
сталкивалось после
conflict
Второй
that
мировой войны.
humankind has encountered
Счет
following
погибших
the
мирных
Second
жителей
World War. The
подбирается к
number of the dead
шокирующей
civilians
отметке
has
30
reached the
тысяч.
shocking
И это
threshold
только
of 30,000
посчитано.
people, and these are only estimates.
Все это время
In
Совет
all this time,
Безопасности
the
ООН
United
не
Nations
может
Security
принять
Council has been
критически важное
unable
решение
to
с
adopt a
требованием о
critically
немедленном
important resolution
прекращении
with a
огня.
demand for an immediate ceasefire.
Хочу напомнить,
I
что
wish to
16
recall
октября
that
прошлого
on the
года, когда
16th of
России был
October
предложен
last
самый
year, when
первый
Russia
проект
proposed the very
резолюции с таким
first
призывом,
draft resolution with this call,
количество погибших
the number of
палестинцев
the dead
было около 1 тысячи
Palestinians were
человек.
approximately 1,000 people.
Тогда западные
At that
делегации в
point,
Совете
Western
предпочли
delegations of the
массово
Council
воздержаться, чтобы
preferred to
не
abstain
навлечь
en
гнев
masse
Вашингтона.
in order not to incur the ire of Washington.
Коллеги, не будет
Colleagues, it will be
преувеличением
no
сказать, что
exaggeration
новые
to state that
28 с лишним
this
тысяч
new figure,
погибших
more than
это цена того
28,000
самого
dead,
первого
is the cost
позорного
of that very
бездействия,
first
коллективной
disgraceful
безответственности
inaction.
западных
This is the
делегаций в
collective
Совете
responsibility of
Безопасности,
Western
у
delegations at the
которых
Security
натовская
Council,
солидарность
for whom
перевешивает любые
solidarity
высокие
within NATO
национальные
transcends
декларации
any
о
lofty
приверженности
national
международному гуманитарному
declarations on
праву,
commitment to international
защите
humanitarian
гражданских
law,
лиц
the
и
protection of
гуманитарного
civilians,
персонала.
and humanitarian personnel.
С тех пор
Since then,
Соединенные
the
Штаты
United States
трижды
three
применяли право
times
вето, чтобы не
exercised the right
допустить
to the
принятия
veto,
Советом
exercised their veto in
требования о
order to
прекращении
prevent
огня.
the Council's adoption of demands for a
Каждый раз
ceasefire. Each
мы слышали
time
от американской
we heard
делегации
from the
одни и
U.S.
те же
delegation
лицемерные
those
призывы
same
еще немного
duplicitous and
подождать,
hypocritical calls to just wait a
дать
little
время
bit
для
longer,
их
to
якобы
give
эффективной
time for
двусторонней
their
дипломатии на земле.
allegedly effective
Но
diplomacy
никакого
on the
результата
ground.
она так и не
However,
принесла.
this did not yield any
Да и не
results
могла
ultimately,
принести,
and
так
it
как
could not
реальная цель
yield any
Вашингтона не
results
мир на Ближнем
because the
Востоке
real
и не
goal of
защита
Washington
мирных
is not to
жителей,
achieve peace in the
а
Middle East,
обеспечение
not
своих
to protect
геополитических
civilians,
интересов,
but rather to
требующих любой
advance their
ценой выгородить
geopolitical
своего
agenda,
ближайшего
demanding at any
ближневосточного союзника.
cost for their closest Middle East ally to be
Поэтому Вашингтон,
shielded. This is
продавив
why
в резолюции
Washington, having
Совета
pushed through in
Безопасности
Security Council
2720
Resolution
фактическую
2720
лицензию Израиля
an
на
effective
убийство
license to kill
палестинцев
for
на
Israel,
оккупированных
to
палестинских
kill
территориях
Palestinians on
под
occupied
предлогом,
Palestinian territory
цитирую,
under the
создания
pretext of, I
условий
quote,
для
establishing
прекращения боевых действий,
conditions for cessation
о
of
чем мы
hostilities,
предупреждали,
which is something we warned
продолжает
about,
обеспечивать международную
continues
защиту
to
властям
provide
Западного
international
Иерусалима
cover
и
for
их
the authorities of Western
безнаказанность за многочисленные
Jerusalem
преступления
and
против
uphold
израильтян.
their impunity for myriad crimes against the people of Gaza.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Distinguished
делегация
colleagues,
Алжира от
the
имени
delegation of
арабской
Algeria, on
группы
behalf of the
предложила
Arab
солидный,
group,
сбалансированный
proposed
проект
a
резолюции, в
robust,
центре
balanced
которого
draft resolution,
долгожданное
at the heart
прекращение
of
огня.
which is a long-anticipated
Алжирские
ceasefire.
коллеги
Our
добросовестно
colleagues, our
организовали
Algerian
переговорный
colleagues,
процесс,
organized negotiations
консультировались
in
со
good
всеми
faith,
делегациями и
conscientiously.
старались
They
максимально
consulted with all
учесть их замечания.
delegations, and they strove to
Хотим
take their
отдельно
remarks into
отметить
account, and we wish to highlight in particular
алжирской
the
переговорной команды.
professionalism shown by our Algerian negotiating team.
Однако делегация Соединенных
However,
Штатов
the
на
U.S.
этот раз с самого
delegation this
начала
time,
фактически
from the
поставила
very beginning,
ультиматум,
effectively
требуя остановить
put
работу над
forward
документом.
an ultimatum demanding a halt
Наши
to work on
американские
the
коллеги
document.
утверждали,
Our U.S.
что
colleagues
представленный
asserted
Алжиром проект
that the
опасен,
draft
так
proposed
как
by
может помешать
Algeria was
деликатной
dangerous insofar as it
дипломатии
would
на земле.
obstruct so-called delicate diplomacy
Только
on
что
the
мы слышали
ground.
то же самое
We just
в этом
heard
зале.
the same in this hall.
Призываю вас всех
We
вдуматься
call
в
on all of
цинизм
you to
этого аргумента.
consider the cynicism of this argument. Effectively, Washington has been proclaiming that the Security Council of the United Nations is in the way of its plans and demanding that the Security Council, not interfere in the U.S.'s plans. And my U.S. colleague just yesterday publicly stated that they would vote against the Algerian draft. Distinguished colleagues, the United States time and time again has been demonstrating utter disregard both for international institutions and multilateral diplomacy and international law. Today, essentially, the authority and the standing of the United Nations Security Council is at stake. We call upon the membership of the Security Council to demonstrate solidarity, to counter the lawlessness of Washington, which is willing to countenance any sacrifice in any region for the advancement of its geopolitical ambitions. The U.S. government has no concern either for the lives of the people of Gaza nor the views of its own people, who are increasingly vocal in their support of the Palestinian people. We should like to hope that within other UN member states and member states of the Security Council, that they generally listen if not to at least the voice of conscience, but at least to public opinion. Public opinion will no longer forgive United Nations inaction. The situation in the south of the Strip, around the city of Rafah, is in the context of Israeli military plans extremely dangerous. The implementation of these plans will result in a catastrophic increase in the magnitude of the humanitarian disaster, at the epicenter of which are more than 1 million residents of Gaza who have fled hostilities in the city to the border with Egypt. There is a need to do everything possible to prevent this kind of a development. Our shared objective is to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible and to provide conditions for the establishment of sustained channels for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in the Strip. We urge the Security Council membership to vote in support of the Algerian draft. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/173 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, over the past few weeks, we have made incredibly clear that the resolution before the Council would not achieve the goal of a sustainable peace and may in fact run counter to it. Proceeding with a vote today was wishful and irresponsible. And so while we cannot support a resolution that would put sensitive negotiations in jeopardy, we look forward to engaging on a text that we believe will address so many of the concerns we all share, a text that can and should be adopted by the Council so that we can have a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable based on the formula of all hostages being released. This temporary ceasefire is critical to getting aid into the hands of Palestinian civilians who desperately need it. We should look towards this text so that we can finally condemn Hamas for their horrific attacks on October 7th, which set this conflict into motion, so that we can empower Senior Coordinator Cog and the United Nations because her success is the UN's success. And it is so very needed to ensure civilians get the aid that they need more efficiently and effectively, and just more, period. And so that ultimately we can together help create a future in which Israelis and Palestinians live in states of their own, side by side, in peace. We're committed to engaging constructively on our resolution with you all in the days to come to that end. And we will continue to tirelessly engage in direct diplomacy and negotiations on the ground. Thank you.
Representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, China expresses its strong disappointment by and dissatisfaction with the outcome of the vote just taken. We have voted in favor of the draft resolution. Algeria, on behalf of the Arab states, put forward the draft resolution demanding a immediate ceasefire in Gaza, immediate release of all hostages, guaranteed access for humanitarian supplies, and opposition to forced transfers. This is both urgently required by the situation on the ground, and it is also based on the minimum requirements of humanity, and it should deserve the support by all Council members. Algeria, by displaying reason, sincerity, and open attitude, held lengthy and extensive consultations with all parties on the draft resolution and took on board many constructive ideas, making the draft resolution more balanced. The outcome of today's vote clearly shows that on the issue of a ceasefire to hold the fighting in Gaza, it is not that the Security Council does not have an overwhelming consensus, but rather it is the exercise of the veto by the United States that has stifled the Council consensus. The U.S. veto sent a wrong message, pushing the situation in Gaza into a more dangerous one. While the Security Council ceasefire resolution is being vetoed, innocent civilians in Gaza are dying in the fighting, and they are struggling on the brink of death. The U.S. claimed that the Council resolution would interfere with the ongoing diplomatic efforts. Such a claim is totally untenable. Given the situation on the ground, the continued passive avoidance on an immediate ceasefire is nothing different from giving a green light to the continued slaughter. While the Security Council ceasefire resolution is being vetoed, the spillover of the conflict is destabilizing the entire Middle East region, leading to a rising risk of a wider war. Only by extinguishing the flames of war in Gaza can we prevent the fires of hell from engulfing the entire region. The Council must act quickly to stop this carnage in the Middle East. While the Council ceasefire resolution is being vetoed, the basics of international law are being trampled upon, and the bedrock of the multilateral system is being eroded. The Secretary General of the United Nations has already written to the Council invoking Article 99 of the Charter, and the International Court of Justice has issued provisional measures. The Council must respond forcefully to the serious violations of the international law and international humanitarian law in the Gaza conflict and uphold the authority of international rule of order. Madam President, the Security Council must take actions to push for a ceasefire. This should not be a matter of debate, but rather this is a moral obligation that the Council cannot shy away. It is a legal responsibility that the Council must assume. Even more so, this is a political requirement that the Council must fulfill in accordance with the Charter. The veto cannot muffle the strong call for a ceasefire and an end to the war. The Security Council cannot stop its work to uphold justice and fulfill its responsibilities just because of the veto. China urges Israel to heed the call of the international community, abandon its plan for Rafah offensive, and stop its collective punishment of the people of Palestine. We expect countries having significant influence to do less of their political calculations, to be truly impartial and responsible, and to make the right choice in pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on the international community to pull all diplomatic efforts to give the people of Gaza a chance to live and give the people of the entire Middle East region a chance to have peace and give it a chance for justice to be upheld. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We voted for the resolution because the killing of civilians in Gaza must stop. The suffering that Palestinians are enduring is beyond anything a human being should be subjected to. A possible Israeli ground offensive in Rafah would have unimaginable humanitarian consequences. It would push us on a path of no return. It is our duty to react before we wake up in a nightmare. And that's why we are convinced it is high time for the Council to pull a brake. Let me emphasize once again that Slovenia condemns the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on 7 October, as well as their continuing attacks on Israel. We continue to call for immediate and safe release of all hostages. We feel the pain of their relatives and loved ones. And we thank the leaders of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States for their tireless efforts, and we hope that negotiations they are facilitating will soon bring peace to Gaza and return the hostages home safely. However, it is the responsibility of this Council to maintain international peace and security. We believe that everyone can and should contribute their piece of the puzzle that will eventually bring peace. We believe in complementarity of all efforts, bilateral, regional, or those of the Council. The Council's role is important, and it is indispensable in order to end hostilities, to bring hostages home, to rapidly and safely deliver humanitarian assistance, and to draft a day-after roadmap. Lastly, the Council has a responsibility towards the international community. Its expectations have been clearly expressed through a General Assembly resolution with the overwhelming support of Member States. It has been clearly manifested by citizens across the globe. Their voices are loud and clear. The war needs to stop. The Security Council needs to hear these voices of global consciousness and respond to their demands and pleas. And it all starts with a call for a ceasefire, to end hostilities, to bring hostages home, to bring water and food to starving Palestinians, and to silence and clear the skies over Gaza and Israel. A call addressed to both sides, Israel and Hamas. It is our firm belief that Algeria proposed a balanced text calling for respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law, addressing all violations committed by both sides of the conflict, and calling for accountability for those violations. It is putting protection of civilians as a civilized norm in the center of our action. We therefore deeply regret that the Council was not able to pass this resolution, which we supported strongly. But we cannot give up. It is our responsibility to continue working towards a consensus in this body for peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
La Suisse a voté en faveur du projet de résolution et regrette qu'il n'ait pas été adopté malgré
and
le
regrets
très
that it
large
was not
soutien
adopted
dont il
despite the very
bénéficie parmi
broad
les membres
support it
de ce
enjoys
Conseil.
among the members of this
Je
Council.
tiens à remercier les
I would
efforts de
like
la
to
délégation
thank
algérienne
the
dans la
Algerian
recherche de
delegation for its efforts
consensus
in
autour de
building
ce texte,
consensus around this
qui
text,
demande notamment
which
un
calls in
cessez-le-feu
particular
humanitaire
for an
immédiat à
immediate
Gaza et
humanitarian
la
ceasefire
libération
in Gaza
immédiate et
and the
inconditionnelle
immediate and
de tous les
unconditional
otages
release of
retenus
all
captifs à
hostages
Gaza
held captive in
depuis les
Gaza
actes de
since the
terreur
acts of
perpétrés par le
terror
Hamas le 7 octobre.
perpetrated by Hamas on
Depuis la
October 7.
soumission de la première version de ce texte,
Almost 3
près
weeks
de
have
3
passed
semaines
since
ont
the
passé.
first draft of this text
La
was
Suisse a
submitted.
salué les intenses
Switzerland
négociations
welcomed
qui
the
se
intense
déroulent dans la région
negotiations taking place
et
in
a
the region
souligné
and
qu'il fallait
stressed
leur
the
laisser le
need
temps nécessaire
to give
pour
them the
aboutir à un
necessary
résultat.
time to reach a result.
En même temps,
At the same
nous avons
time,
insisté sur la
we
responsabilité
stress
de
the
ce Conseil
responsibility of
d'agir
this Council to
conformément à
act
son mandat
in
pour le
accordance with its
respect du droit
mandate
international
for the
humanitaire
respect of
et
international
surtout la
humanitarian law
protection
and
des
especially
civils.
the protection of civilians.
Nous regrettons qu'une condamnation
We
plus
regret
ferme et
that a
explicite des
firmer
actes de
and
terreur du
more
Hamas
explicit
n'ait été
condemnation of
retenue dans la
Hamas's acts of
résolution
terror was
malgré
not
les
included in the
injonctions de
resolution,
plusieurs membres du Conseil,
despite the
dont la
injunctions of
Suisse.
several Council members,
Toutefois,
including Switzerland.
la nécessité de
However,
protéger la population
the
civile à
need to
Gaza
protect the civilian
augmente de
population in
jour en
Gaza
jour.
is growing
Le respect du
day
droit
by day.
international humanitaire et des
Respect
droits
for
humains,
international humanitarian
notamment en
law
ce qui
and human
concerne
rights,
la protection des
particularly
civils, doit
as
rester une
regards the
priorité
protection of
de ce
civilians,
Conseil.
must remain
En
a
vertu
priority
des
for this
conventions de
Council.
Genève,
Under the Geneva
l'acheminement de
Conventions,
l'aide humanitaire doit
the
être
delivery
sûr,
of
rapide
humanitarian
et
aid
sans
must be
entrave.
safe,
Nous ne
rapid and
pouvons admettre
unimpeded.
que des centaines
We
de milliers
cannot
de
allow
civils
hundreds of
assiégés
thousands of
soient laissés en
besieged
proie
civilians
à la
to be left prey
famine
to
et aux
famine
épidémies
and
sans
epidemics
garantie de
without
sécurité
adequate
adéquate,
guarantees
que ce
of
soit pour la
security
fourniture de
for the
l'assistance
delivery of
humanitaire
humanitarian
et pour leur
assistance
propre protection.
and for their own
De
protection.
plus, la
In
Suisse est
addition,
très préoccupée par le
Switzerland is
risque
very
d'une opération
concerned about the
militaire
risk of a
d'envergure à Rafah
large-scale
et de
military
l'escalade régionale
operation in
ultérieure
Rafah and the
qu'elle pourrait
subsequent
entraîner.
regional
Le
escalation
projet
it
de
could
résolution
entail.
revêtait ainsi
The
un
draft
caractère
resolution was
préventif
therefore intended
par
as a
rapport à une
preventative
nouvelle
measure
escalade sur
against further
place
escalation
qui
on
met
the
en
spot,
danger la vie de
which
tous les
would
civils,
endanger the
y
lives
inclut
of all
les otages.
civilians, including the
C'est
hostages.
pourquoi l'appel
This is
à un
why the
cessez-le-feu
call for
humanitaire
an
immédiat à
immediate
Gaza
humanitarian
s'inscrit
ceasefire in
dans la
Gaza
logique
is
de
in
notre
line
engagement
with our
collectif
collective
à respecter et faire
to
respecter les
respect and
conventions de
ensure
Genève
respect for the
et le
Geneva
droit international
Conventions and
humanitaire en
international
toutes
humanitarian law
circonstances.
in all
La Suisse
circumstances.
reste engagée pour une
Switzerland
action
remains
unifiée du
committed
Conseil en
to
ce sens.
unified
Nous
action by the
rappelons en
Council in
outre
this
que les
direction.
parties sont
We also
tenues de
recall
respecter les deux
that the
précédentes
parties are obliged to
résolutions
respect
de
the
ce
two
Conseil
previous
à
Council
ce sujet.
resolutions on this
Et nous
subject.
rappelons également la
And we
nature
would also recall the
obligatoire des
mandatory
mesures
nature of the
conservatoires que
provisional
la Cour
measures
internationale de
ordered
justice
by the
a
International
ordonnées
Court
le
of
26
Justice
janvier
on
dernier. Je vous
26
remercie.
January. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
la
Chair,
France remercie
France
l'Algérie
thanks Algeria
d'avoir
for
proposé cette
preparing
résolution.
and proposing this
Elle
resolution.
regrette
It
qu'elle n'ait
regrets
pas pu être adoptée
that the
compte
resolution
tenu
was
de la
not
situation
adopted given
catastrophique
the
sur le
disastrous
terrain.
situation on the ground.
La libération immédiate
The immediate
et
and
inconditionnelle de tous les
unconditional release
otages,
of all
demandée
hostages,
explicitement par les résolutions
specifically
2712
and
et
explicitly requested
2720,
by resolutions
tout comme
2712
le
and
projet, par le
2720
projet
of our
qui vient
Council,
d'être
as
rejeté,
well as the draft
doit
that was just
intervenir sans
rejected,
plus de délai.
should
Il y a urgence
take
à
place
conclure
without
un
further
accord
delay.
sur un
There is
cessez-le-feu
extreme
qui garantisse
urgency
enfin
to,
la
without
protection de
further
tous les
delay,
civils
conclude an
et
agreement on a
l'entrée
ceasefire
massive
that would
et sans
finally guarantee the
entrave
protection of all
de l'aide
civilians and a
d'urgence. Le
massive
bilan humain et
delivery
la
of
situation
emergency
humanitaire à
aid.
Gaza sont
The human
intolérables
toll and the
et les
humanitarian
opérations
situation in Gaza
israéliennes
is
doivent
intolerable
cesser.
and Israeli
Il est
operations
urgent
must stop.
d'acheminer
It's
massivement
urgent to
l'aide
massively
humanitaire à la
deliver
population de Gaza.
humanitarian aid
Il est
to the
impératif
Gaza
d'ouvrir le port
population. It's
d'Ashdod, une
imperative
voie terrestre directe
to
depuis la
open
Jordanie
the
et
Ashdod
tous les points de
port
passage.
and
Il est
open a
inacceptable
land path
que ce
directly
Conseil
between
n'ait toujours pas
Jordan
condamné les
through
actes
all
terroristes
points of
commis par le
passage. It's
Hamas et
also
d'autres groupes terroristes le 7
incomprehensible and
octobre,
unacceptable that this council
ainsi
still has not
que les
condemned
violences
the terrorist
sexuelles
acts committed
utilisées
by
comme arme de
Hamas on
guerre
7
par ces
October
terroristes. La
with other
France le
terrorists
déplore et appelle
and sexual violence
ce
used as a
Conseil à sortir
weapon of war
rapidement de
by
cette
these terrorists.
coupable
We strongly
ambiguïté.
deplore
Elle rappelle son
this situation
attachement
and call upon the
indéfectible
council
à la
to
sécurité
rapidly clear
d'Israël
itself
et elle
of
rappelle
this
aussi sa
ambiguous guilt.
solidarité avec le
France
peuple
reiterates its its
après
attachment
ces
to
attaques
Israeli
terroristes.
security
La France continuera de
and
s'engager
will
résolument
continue
dans la voie d'une
to
mobilisation de ce
resolutely be
Conseil
committed
sur
to
l'ensemble
full
des
mobilization of
volets
this
de la
council
crise,
on all aspects of this
sécuritaire,
crisis, security,
humanitaire, mais
humanitarian,
aussi
and
politique.
also political.
La France rappelle que seule la solution des
We
deux
recall
États est
that
à même de
only a
répondre aux besoins de
two-state
sécurité
solution
d'Israël
can
et du peuple
possibly meet the
israélien,
needs
ainsi qu'aux
of security
aspirations
for
légitimes
Israel and
des
the Israeli people,
Palestiniens
as well as
à
the
un
legitimate
État.
aspiration of the
Elle
Palestinians
implique
to
la
a state.
création d'un
It
État
involves the
palestinien
creation of a
vivant
Palestinian
dans la paix paix
state
et la
that would live in
sécurité
peace and
aux
security
côtés d'Israël.
alongside
Je vous
Israel.
remercie.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam the President, I wish to begin by expressing our gratitude to the Presidency of Guyana for having convened this meeting to take action on this important resolution on the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We also express our sincere appreciation to Algeria for the tireless work that led to the tabling of the resolution aimed at ending the totally unacceptable and unbearable suffering of the Palestinian people, the humanitarian catastrophe currently unfolding in Gaza. Madam President, by voting in favor of this Security Council resolution, Mozambique aligns herself with the international community as a whole in its effort that overwhelmingly calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. We consider it imperative that all parties scrupulously comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international law, human rights law, in particular with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructures. We strongly call for the total and full compliance with the provisional measures laid down by the order of the International Court of Justice within the scope of Articles 2 and 3 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, handed down on January 26, 2024. Throughout history, we had our share of painful experience with war and armed conflict. It is on this basis and on the dictates of the laws of war that we embrace that Mozambique firmly opposes the forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population, women and children in particular. In that connection, we strongly appeal for the full implementation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions 2712 of 2023 and 2720 also of 2023. In the same vein, Mozambique demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as a guarantee of humanitarian access to meet the medical needs of all hostages. Mr. President, Madam President, we urge the international community and this Security Council in particular to continue working tirelessly together towards achieving peace and stability in the region based on a two-state solution for the people of Palestine and Israel. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of Korea voted in favor of the resolution proposed by Algeria, considering the urgent need for a humanitarian ceasefire to end the suffering of civilians in Gaza. Right now in Rafah, where more than half of the entire population of Gaza is densely packed, people are panicking at a looming catastrophe that may be caused by a full-scale ground operation. The Republic of Korea could not ignore the possibility of another humanitarian calamity that will lead to a huge number of fatalities. Nonetheless, we adhere to our position that the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October is the direct cause of the current disaster in Gaza. Thus, it is regrettable that a clear and unified condemnation of the deplorable terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas was missing in the draft resolution. Madam President, the Republic of Korea takes note that serious negotiations among key stakeholders, namely Egypt, Qatar, US, and Israel, are vigorously ongoing on the ground to achieve the long overdue release of the hostages. We express our strong support and appreciation for these efforts. The Republic of Korea will continue to engage in Council deliberations actively and constructively to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, as well as the realization of the two-state solution. I thank you.
Representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. It has been over 4 months of devastation, hostilities, and suffering since Hamas' horrifying acts of terror against Israel. We are witnessing an alarming escalation of violence and unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe. The situation on the ground is only worsening as each day goes by. Particularly, the situation in Rafah is deeply concerning. Japan appreciates the ongoing tireless diplomatic efforts led by US and other countries towards the release of hostages, improving the humanitarian situation, and calming down the situation as soon as possible. Japan believes that humanitarian ceasefire needs to be realized promptly in such a way to ensure a conducive environment for sufficient humanitarian assistance activities, as well as to lead to the release of the remaining hostages, therefore resulting in realization of a sustainable ceasefire. Based on this position, we call on all the parties concerned to act immediately from a humanitarian viewpoint. In this vein, Japan voted in favor of this draft resolution. We would like to express our gratitude to Algeria for their efforts to coordinate various positions among the Council members. At the same time, in efforts to ensure a more fair and balanced text, the resolution should have included a condemnation of Hamas terrorist attacks, which the Security Council has so far failed to speak out. Though we couldn't agree on a resolution which all the Council members can support, we are all engaging seriously to stop the violence. This Council should be a place to explore and find a peace and security jointly, not a place to aim for finger-pointing. Japan will continue to work constructively with other Council members to find a path forward for peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta also thanks Algeria for their measured and constructive approach as penholders throughout the negotiations. Malta voted in favor of this draft, and we unequivocally reiterate our call for a permanent ceasefire. It is therefore regrettable that the use of the veto prevents this Council from calling for an end to this conflict. We also believe that the Council has provided the ongoing negotiations taking place on the ground the necessary space and time. However, regrettably, we still find ourselves on the precipice of another wave of hostilities. This will undoubtedly have catastrophic consequences on the civilian population in Rafah, an area already designated as a safe zone. We also reject and denounce any forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population from and within Gaza. Such actions amount to grave breaches of international law. The severely deteriorating humanitarian conditions and the threat of famine within Gaza are extremely troubling and need to be urgently addressed. Israel is required to facilitate the full, rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. At the same time, UNRWA remains essential to ensure an effective humanitarian response. The broader regional situation also continues to be deeply worrying. Under these circumstances, the full and immediate implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720 is now more pressing than ever. Let us be clear, this Council has the duty and responsibility to make sure that its decisions are respected. We also echo the call for the remaining hostages to be immediately, safely, and unconditionally released, and we call on this Council to denounce the terrorist acts of October 7th. In closing, President, Malta underlines its unwavering commitment to a comprehensive peace based on the two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. We want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible in a way that never again allows Hamas to carry out the appalling terrorist attacks against Israel we saw on the 7th of October last year. Palestinian civilians are facing a devastating humanitarian crisis. We're particularly worried about the situation in Rafah, where a military operation could have appalling consequences for civilians sheltering there with nowhere else to go. Ongoing negotiations are critical to secure the release of the hostages held in Gaza. We are calling for an immediate suspension in fighting to get aid in and hostages out, leading to a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. That means the release of all hostages, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package, removing Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel, Hamas no longer in charge of Gaza, and a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. President, we welcome the efforts of our Algerian colleagues on this resolution, and we regret that some of our proposals were not taken on board. Simply calling for a ceasefire, as this resolution does, will not make it happen. Indeed, as it could endanger the hostage negotiations, it could actually make a ceasefire less likely. The way to stop the fighting and potentially stop it from restarting is to begin with a pause to get hostages out and aid in. That is what we are calling for. It could end the fighting now. We will continue to work for a stop to fighting, a humanitarian response at scale, the release of all hostages, and the delivery of the two sovereign states of Israel and Palestine that ensures peace, security, and justice for both countries. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, the delegation of Sierra Leone would like to thank Algeria for proposing and facilitating efforts to agree to a resolution that would have inter alia led to an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. We further thank the Algerian delegation for leading a reasonable, transparent, and inclusive process. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the draft resolution because of the imperative for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The Security Council is mandated to act promptly and effectively in order to maintain international peace and security. The Council has had its attention called to the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and for it to act under Article 99 of the UN Charter by the Secretary General. Some members of the Security Council have had the opportunity to visit both Rafah crossing from the Egyptian border and Israel, including representatives of the delegation of Sierra Leone. The assessment therefrom has been that only a humanitarian ceasefire will put an end to the unbearable killings in Gaza and certainly the looming and unthinkable catastrophe in Rafah. Sierra Leone appreciates and commends member states embarking on diplomatic engagement with parties to the conflict to secure a prolonged pause to the hostilities. But while we do so, we remain worried that reaching a meaningful conclusion in practical terms takes time, a luxury that cannot be afforded by the suffering Palestinian people, the families of the hostages, and the hostages themselves. The other main organs of the United Nations have acted timeously and effectively in this tragic conflict. The UN General Assembly has adopted resolutions ES 1021 and ES 1022, with the overwhelming majority demanding in the latter an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The Secretary General of the UN invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter, last used over half a century ago, to warn us in this Council of the humanitarian catastrophe we now see in Gaza. As Council members, we were urged to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The International Court of Justice has acted promptly and rightly when called upon to do so by South Africa. Following the request for an indication of provisional measures, the ICJ, in the 26 January 2024 order, in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel, inter alia specifically ordered, and I quote, that the State of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, end of quote. The court deemed it necessary to emphasize that all parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip are bound by international humanitarian law. It expressed its grave concern that the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack in Israel on 7 October 2023 and held since then by Hamas and other armed groups, and calls for their immediate and unconditional release. The ICJ further reminded the parties that the provisional measures ordered under Article 41 of the ICJ statute have binding effect and thus create international legal obligations for any party to whom the provisional measures are addressed. Sierra Leone is of the view that in the absence of any prima facie change in the current perilous humanitarian conditions prevailing in Gaza, coupled with the continuing perpetuation of the hostage situation following the 26 January 2024 order of the ICJ, the UN Security Council is now more than ever compelled to act, to use the myriad of tools available to us as a council to save human lives and put a check on the mounting death toll and inordinate destruction of civilian objects. Madam President, it is extremely worrisome that after over 130 days in the conflict, a draft resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, rejecting forced displacement of the Palestinians, reiterating the call for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access into Gaza, and the optimal political solution of a two-state solution could not be adopted which we deeply regret. At this stage, with the immense suffering, death, and anguish in Gaza, the Security Council must not relent until a complete halt to the continuing hostilities in Gaza Strip and in the West Bank is achieved. To do otherwise is to accept passively the prevalent criticisms of dysfunctionality of this council. Meanwhile, the reality in Gaza is that of famine-like conditions, malnutrition, displacement, and the spread of infectious diseases, and the potential for spillover of the conflict in the wider region. Our failure to act extinguishes hope, the hope that 1.3 million Palestinians in Rafah have supplicated to us, and beyond this, the hope that humanity has placed in us as members to deliver on the Council's mandate. This must awaken our resolve to act. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone sincerely looks forward to not only having a positive outcome from the ongoing diplomatic negotiations being mediated by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, but also as a Security Council will have a product that will call for a full and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire and release of all hostages. This, we hope, will lead to an end in the fighting and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam Chair,
agradezco a
I would like
Argelia
to
por
thank
el
Algeria
proyecto de resolución
for the draft
presentado.
resolution that was
El
introduced.
Ecuador ha votado
Ecuador
a favor del mismo
voted in
debido
favor
a que
of it,
considera que el Consejo
given
debe
that it believes that the
pronunciarse
Council
frente a
needs
una
to take a
situación
stand
humanitaria
on the humanitarian
en constante
situation,
deterioro,
which is constantly
con miles
unraveling,
de víctimas
with
inocentes.
thousands of innocent
El
victims.
proyecto que hemos
The
votado no es
draft
perfecto,
that we just
ni
voted
se
on
han
was not
incluido en él
perfect
todos los
and
puntos que
included in it
consideramos
all the issues
apropiados,
that we think were
pero ha sido
appropriate,
presentado
but
luego
it
de un
was
proceso de
presented after
negociación
a
e
negotiations
incluye elementos
process
necesarios
that
ante una
included the
situación que se agrava
necessary elements
minuto
about
a
a
minuto.
situation which is
En lo
deteriorating
principal, el
minute
texto
by
que
minute.
acabamos de votar demanda un cese al
Mainly,
fuego
it
humanitario
requests a
que
humanitarian
permitiría
ceasefire that
aliviar
would
la
make it
situación de la
possible to
población
alleviate
civil,
the
al
situation
tiempo
for
que
the
exige
civilian
la
population.
liberación
And
inmediata
it also
e
demands the
incondicional
immediate and
de todos los
unconditional release
rehenes
of all
y deplora
hostages.
la
And it
violencia contra
deplores
civiles
the
y
violence
todos los
against
actos de
civilians and
terrorismo,
all acts of
incluyendo
terrorism, including
implícitamente los
implicitly
execrables actos
the
cometidos por
horrific
Hamas
acts
en octubre
committed by
pasado.
Hamas in
Sin
October of
embargo,
last year. However,
cabe mencionar que el Ecuador,
it's worth mentioning
al igual que
that
varios miembros
Ecuador,
del
like
Consejo,
several members of
ha
the Council,
requerido
insistently
que el texto
required
contenga
that the
una
text
condena
have
explícita
an
a
explicit
los actos
condemnation of
terroristas
the
de Hamas.
terrorist
Lamentamos
actions of
que
Hamas,
no se
and
haya
we
incluido en el
regret
texto
that it
esta
was not
condena,
included in
pues
the text.
consideramos
That
que es
condemnation was not
indispensable
there.
señalar
However, we think
claramente
it's
las
important to clearly
responsabilidades que
signal
son evidentes
the
en el
responsibility
presente para luego
that
demandar
is
también
evident
las
of all those
responsabilidades
present, and
que
also
se
point to the
conocerán en el
responsibilities
futuro.
that will be seen
El
in
Ecuador,
future.
señora Presidenta,
Ecuador, Madam Chair,
lamenta que en
regrets
esta ocasión
at this
no se
time
haya podido adoptar
that
una
it was not
resolución
possible to
y
adopt a
continuará
resolution, and it will
trabajando
continue
para que el
working
Consejo pueda
so that the
pronunciarse
Council
y
can
actuar
take a stance and
efectivamente
act
mediante
effectively
una adopción
through
exitosa. Muchas
successful
gracias.
adoption. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
уважаемые коллеги,
distinguished colleagues,
сегодня мы
today
стали
we
свидетелями
have borne
очередной
witness to yet
черной
another
страницы в истории
dark
Совета Безопасности
chapter
ООН.
in the history of the United Nations Security
Ее
Council.
вновь написала
This was
делегация Соединенных
yet again written by the United States
преследует всю
delegation,
ту
the U.S.
цель
delegation which continues to
покрывать
pursue the
своего
same
ближайшего
objective,
ближневосточного
to provide
союзника
cover for its
и
closest
максимально
Middle East
тянуть время,
ally, and to
чтобы он
drag
смог
out
завершить
time
свои
to the
бесчеловечные планы в
greatest
отношении
possible
Газы,
extent for them to be able to
а
carry out their
именно
inhumane
выдавить из
plans
сектора палестинцев
against
и
Gaza,
полностью
specifically
зачистить
to
анклав,
expel the Palestinians
причем
from
в прямом смысле,
the strip
превратив
and to
его в
completely
необитаемую
cleanse
территорию.
the strip, essentially and quite literally transforming it into an uninhabitable territory. Under these circumstances, there are open discussions in Israeli political circles about categories which completely rule out the two-state solution. Once again, having pitted calls for calling an end to the carnage in Gaza against demands to condemn the actions of Hamas, in doing so, our U.S. colleagues have once again hypocritically remained silent about the fact that on the 18th of October, they, having already vetoed the Brazilian draft resolution with this condemnation. The Algerian draft was capable of reversing this situation, of ending the annihilation of Palestinians in Gaza. Unfortunately, the latest, the now fourth U.S. veto prevented this from happening and doomed the fates of another thousands of peaceful citizens of Gaza. However, everybody needs to understand that this result is not the failure in the work of the UN Security Council, which today was effectively united. Rather, this is the pernicious policy of a single member of the Security Council, namely the United States. Full responsibility for the consequences of this lies with Washington, regardless of its attempts to elude this responsibility, expatiating on its quote-unquote important mediation efforts. Regardless of how bitter the aftertaste of today's meeting may be, we have no intention of throwing in the towel. The demand from the UN Security Council for the parties to immediately adopt a ceasefire remains imperative. Absent this, any council product will be devoid of practical purpose. We all had an opportunity to see this based on the example of the toothless humanitarian resolutions on Gaza that the Council had previously adopted. And these remained letters on paper because, as we warned, amid circumstances of active hostilities, it is impossible to deliver humanitarian assistance or to monitor humanitarian pauses. Now, turning to the U.S. text, which previously today was so proactively championed by the United States representative, as far as we are aware, this text has not even been officially circulated at the Security Council, not to mention the fact that there was no comprehensive or meaningful discussion thereof. For this reason, for now, this all looks like further spoilers which are designed to detract attention from the latest shameful veto exercised by the U.S. veto on a critically significant resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on the membership of the Security Council not to be misled by the duplicitous admonitions that there is a need to wait just a little bit longer. The United Nations Security Council and the world waited for 5 months, and with each passing hour that we wait, there are more and more human victims. The U.S. draft does not contain, I emphasize this, does not contain a call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The text refers only to a temporary, and even this when the conditions are ripe. So there is no real alternative to the Algerian draft resolution which the U.S. vetoed. This brainchild is no viable alternative and cannot be any viable alternative to that. This is yet another bad faith attempt by Washington to drag out the time for the purposes of advancing Israel's benefit, interest, and allowing it to definitively resolve the Palestinian question. Our shared objective is to prevent this from taking place and to achieve a just peace between the Palestinians and Israel on the basis of Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions. Let us resolve this together, and perhaps our U.S. colleagues will at some point have their conscience awakened.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to express my appreciation to all the members of the Security Council
لمشاركتهم
for constructively participating
طوال عملية
in the
التفاوض.
negotiations.
كما أشكر
Allow me
جميع
also to
الدول
thank all
التي
states
صوتت
that voted for
لصالح مشروع القرار
and not against
وحتى
the
تلك
draft
التي
resolution.
لم تعترض
I
عن
also thank
اعتماد
those who
هذا المشروع.
abstained,
هذا المشروع
because this
الذي
draft
يطالب
resolution
أساساً
calls mainly
بوقف إطلاق النار في غزة.
for a ceasefire in Gaza.
لقد كان مشروع القرار هذا
The draft resolution
يحمل رسالة قوية إلى
would have sent
الفلسطينيين
a strong message to Palestinians,
مفادها أن العالم
saying that the world
لا يقف صامتا
is not
أمام
standing idly by
محنتهم.
their suffering.
لكن
However,
ومع الأسف
and unfortunately,
مجلس الأمن
the Security Council
فشل مرة
failed
أخرى.
once again
فشل في أن يرتقي
to rise to
إلى
the calls
مستوى
and
نداءات
aspirations
الشعوب
of peoples of the world.
وتطلعاتها. هذا الفشل الذي
This failure
لا يعفيه
does not
من
absolve the
القيام
Security Council of
بالمسؤولية
shouldering its responsibilities.
ولا يعفيه
This failure
المجموعة
does
الدولية
not absolve the international community
من
of its
إجابتها
obligations
تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزل.
vis-à-vis the unarmed Palestinian people.
ولا يعفي
This
سلطات
failure
الاحتلال
does not absolve the occupation power
من واجب تنفيذ
of its obligation
التدابير
to implement
التحفظية
the precautionary
لمحكمة العدل
measures
الدولية.
ordered by the International Court of Justice.
لقد حان الوقت
It is high
لكي
time for the
يتوقف
aggression
العدوان
to end.
ونتمكن
It is high
من
time
تسهيل
for
وصول
humanitarian
المساعدة
assistance to be
الإنسانية
delivered across
إلى
Gaza
جميع أحياء غزة. من الواضح أن
It is
قرارين
clear that resolutions
27/12
2712
و
and
27/20
2720
لم يحققا
did not achieve
النتائج المرجوة
their objectives.
وأن
It
المساعدات
is clear
لا تلبي
that
الحد
assistance
الأدنى
did not meet the
للفلسطينيين.
basic needs of the Palestinian people.
علينا أن نعترف
We have to
أن وقف
acknowledge
إطلاق النار
that only a
وحده.
ceasefire,
وقف إطلاق النار
only
وحده
a
هو
ceasefire
ما يحقق
can
الهدف
achieve
المنشود.
the desired objective.
سيد الرئيس،
Madam President,
إن الوضع الحالي
the current
يفرض
situation
على الجميع
requires
مثل ما
everyone,
أكده
as stressed
رئيس
by
الجمهورية
the
السيد
Algerian
عبد المجيد
President,
تبون
His Excellency Abdelmajid
العمل
Tebboune,
العمل على إعلام مبادئ
to
ومقاصد
work
الأمم المتحدة
on putting the
وتوفير
purposes and principles
الحماية
of the United
اللازمة للشعب
Nations
الفلسطيني
first, to provide the
ووضع
necessary
حد
protection to the Palestinian
للظلم
people
التاريخي
and to put an end
المسلط
to their
عليه.
historic injustice.
سيد الرئيس،
Madam President,
إن شعوب منطقتنا
the people of our region
كانت
have always
ولا تزال
looked
تنظر
up
إلى مجلس
to the
الأمن
Security Council
باعتباره عنوان
as the
الشرعية
source
الدولية.
of international legitimacy.
لكنه
However,
مع الأسف
and unfortunately,
خذلها مرة أخرى.
the Security Council has failed them once
إن
again.
رسالتنا اليوم لكم
Our message to you today
هي أنه على المجموعة الدولية
is that the international community
أن تتجاوب مع مطالب
should respond
وقف
to the
القتل
calls
الذي
for ending the
يستهدف
killing of
الفلسطينيين
Palestinians
وذلك من خلال
by calling
المطالبة بوقف إطلاق
for
النار
an
فوراً
immediate ceasefire.
وأنه على من يعرقل ذلك
All those
أن يراجع
impeding such calls
سياسته
should review
وحساباته
their policies and
لأن
their
القرارات
calculations
الخاطئة لليوم
because wrong decisions today
تحسب
will have a cost
منطقتنا
on our region
والعالم
and our
نتائجها
world tomorrow.
غدا عنفا
And this cost will be
وعدم
violence
استقرار
and instability.
فأسألوا أنفسكم
So ask yourselves,
وضمائركم
examine your conscience.
عن نتائج قراراتكم
What will your decisions
وكيف
today cause?
سيحكم عليكم
How will history judge you?
التاريخ سيد الرئيس
Madam President,
قبل أن أختم
before I conclude,
أقول للجميع
I would like to tell everyone
أننا سندفن
that we
أننا
will
سندفن
bury
شهدائنا
our martyrs
هذا المساء
this evening
برفح
in Rafah,
بغزة
in Gaza,
بكل فلسطين
in all Palestine,
وأن الجزائر
and that Algeria
ستعود غدا
will return
باسم
tomorrow
الأمة العربية
on behalf of the Arab world,
وباسم الأمة
on
الإسلامية
behalf of Muslim countries,
وباسم أحرار
and on
العالم
behalf of all the free people in the world.
ومعنا أرواح الآلاف
Powered by the souls
من
of
الأبرياء
thousands of innocent people
أزهقها
killed
المحتل الإسرائيلي
by the Israeli occupation
من دون حساب
with no
ولا
accountability
عقاب.
whatsoever.
ستعود الجزائر
Algeria will return
لتدق
to knock
أبواب مجلس
on the
الأمن
doors
مرة
of the
أخرى
Security Council once again
وتطالب
to call
بوقف
for
حمام
putting
الدم
an end
في
to the
فلسطين.
bloodshed in Palestine.
ولن نتوقف
We will not stop
حتى يتحمل هذا المجلس
this council
كامل
shoulders
مسؤولياته
its responsibilities in full
ويفرض وقفا
and imposes
إطلاق النار فوريا
an immediate ceasefire.
فإن لنا نفوسا لا تمل
We will never tire
وعزيمة
and we will
لا تكل.
never stop.
وشكرا.
Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. Colleagues, Guyana is disappointed that this council has once again been unable to deliver a ceasefire for the people of Gaza. A ceasefire is the difference between life and death for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and others trapped in the war zone that Gaza has become. The delegation of Algeria has approached the tabling of this resolution with great patience, transparency, and inclusivity. They have listened to all sides, acquiescing to requests for additional time to be given to other efforts underway. It has been almost 3 weeks since the draft was circulated, and we still find ourselves at square one. In that time, almost 2,000 more Palestinians were killed in Gaza, another 2,000 more injured. In those 3 weeks, every aspect of life in Gaza has gotten worse. Internal displacement has increased, with a serious crisis underway in Rafah. Food insecurity continued to worsen, with the latest Integrated Food Security and Nutrition Phase Classification, IPC, report stating that Gaza now has the highest share of persons facing devastating levels of acute food insecurity that the IPC has ever classified for any given area or country. The humanitarian situation has been described as increasingly severe. Humanitarian access is extremely limited, and people's desperation has led them to looting aid trucks to secure a morsel of food. The population is in dire straits. The most vulnerable among them, including children, the elderly, and people with underlying conditions, are especially vulnerable to malnutrition. And all of this is happening in freezing temperatures. In that time, we have also seen a further hardening of positions for the worse. For example, we have heard the determination of the Israeli government to proceed with a ground operation in Rafah, despite the strong urgings to the contrary by many of its friends and partners and others in the international community. We know what a ground operation in Rafah would mean for the people who were driven there by the Israeli Defense Force. The ICJ orders of 26th of January are being completely ignored, as though there is no obligation to adhere to them. UN personnel are continuing to operate in Gaza under these extremely dangerous circumstances, with unprecedented numbers of them killed since 7th of October. Deconfliction mechanisms are not being respected, so everyone is at risk and nowhere is safe. Dear colleagues, what else needs to happen to act for the people in Gaza? How many more lives must be lost? How many more must be maimed? How many more? We need a ceasefire now. Resolutions 2712 and 2720 cannot be fully implemented if there is no ceasefire. The longer we take to agree on the need for a ceasefire, the longer this Council will be seen as being complicit in what is taking place in Gaza. To be clear, Guyana also calls for the release of all hostages taken on October 7th and Palestinians unlawfully detained in Israeli prisons without trial. Though progress has been stalled for decades, the two-state solution still remains the best option for a permanent and lasting resolution of the Palestinian question. The current situation in Gaza puts the two-state solution at great risk, especially given the rhetoric from some Israeli government officials. Guyana calls on this Council to act now for Gaza and for the future of both Palestine and Israel. A peaceful and stable Israel depends on a peaceful and stable Palestine. The two are not mutually exclusive. And a peaceful Palestine and Israel is crucial for lasting peace and stability of the Middle East region. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, we thank you and your friendly country, Guyana, for your leadership of the Security Council. We thank Algeria for all its efforts and its statement that my brother Ammar delivered a few minutes ago in bringing forth the draft resolution on behalf of the Arab group that has just been voted regarding the grave situation that continues to be faced by the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip as Israel, the occupying power, carries on with its genocidal war. We also thank the 13 members of the Security Council who voted in favor of the draft. And we thank you also for your intense engagement with the Arab group, led by our brother, the Ambassador of Algeria, during the course of the last 3 weeks, negotiating in good faith, of trying to save the Palestinian people's lives in the Gaza Strip and not to allow the looming catastrophe flying over our heads in having a further catastrophe on the Gaza Strip. We sincerely thank you for that effort, for your principled position, and for your determination that a ceasefire has to be demanded, implemented now to save lives, to save the Gaza Strip, to save the 1.5 million Palestinians in the Rafah district. This draft resolution was brought to the Council precisely because Israel persists with the onslaught, persists with every single grave breach it has been committing, despite the near unanimous calls by the international community for a ceasefire, and despite the ICJ provisional measures ordered to Israel to cease all acts of genocide and incitement to genocide, and to ensure humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, who every day are facing death and destruction and the torment of starvation and repeated forced displacement. It has been nearly 3 weeks since I last addressed the Council following the Court's order appealing for action to be taken to ensure the implementation of the provisional measures, to ensure a ceasefire that would protect the Palestinian people and avert the further ravaging of their lives by the Israeli onslaught. But our appeals have regrettably been to no avail. Between our last Council session on the 31st of January and today, the casualty toll has risen from 26,000 Palestinians killed by the Israeli occupying forces to now almost 30,000 people killed and more than 69,000 people injured. This means that in just the past 20 days alone, Israel has killed nearly 4,000 more Palestinian children, women, and men in just 20 days. This is a deplorable consequence of inaction. It means more than 200 Palestinians killed every day. It means that by the time this Security Council session ends, more than 25 Palestinians will have been killed. It means more babies will be murdered, wounded, amputated, and orphaned. More children will die of hunger and hypothermia and disease. It means the continued threat of the further forced displacement of families, the looming danger of a mass expulsion or worse, slaughter of the nearly 1.5 million people in Rafah who have nowhere to flee, no protection whatsoever. It means the continued deprivation of the entire population of Gaza, left without food, water, medicine, and shelter, essential to alleviate suffering and ensure survival. It means that the human lives that could have been spared and saved are instead being forsaken to Israel's genocidal war machine, deliberately, knowingly, by those who oppose a ceasefire. We all know this. We know the staggering figures. We have heard the warning from the Secretary General, the heads of all UN agencies on the ground, dozens of independent special rapporteurs and humanitarian and human rights agencies the world over. We have seen it with our own eyes in pictures and videos that have seared and stained our collective conscience and broken our hearts and our humanity. In the face of Israel's brazen violation of the ICJ order, the court sent another warning, issued another decision on 16 February, reminding Israel that it is bound to fully comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention and all the provisional measures ordered by the court on 26 January. The court also had to remind Israel that its obligations are immediate and should be effective. The call for ceasefire should have been agreed to long time ago. What threshold needs to be crossed for this Council to finally demand a ceasefire? What could be more serious than the crime than genocide? History, as my brother Ammar said, is going to judge the Council harshly. It is already doing so, impairing its credibility and authority in the eyes of people all over the world, perhaps irreparably. But we will not be complacent in this inaction. We have a duty to our people to seek every possible pathway to bring an end to the slaughter, an end to the trauma and terror, an end to the threats to expel them from their land. We will not be silent, and we will act with every legitimate means to uphold our sacred obligations to defend and protect our people and to pursue justice for them. That is why we have come back to the Security Council over and over again, imploring it to act to protect our people. That is why we will not relent in seeking accountability, calling on the Council, the General Assembly, and all states to act in line with the Charter and all obligations under international law without selectivity, without exception. We will not stop demanding accountability for the war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide that Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian people. But accountability must move beyond words in these chambers. It must mean real consequences for the occupying power for its criminal behavior. To this end, I just have returned around midnight last night from The Hague, where the State of Palestine stood before the ICJ, appealing to the Court for Justice after more than 75 years of Nakba, 56 years of belligerent occupation, 17 years of blockade, and nearly 140 days of vindictive, punitive siege and massacres perpetrated by Israel in Gaza, which is a genocide. What crimes has Israel not committed yet? We have gone to the court along with an unprecedented number of countries to confront the Israeli impunity that has made life a living hell for the Palestinian people, appealing for an immediate and complete end to this illegal colonial occupation and apartheid regime, the root cause of all the ills our people are suffering, including this genocidal war. The court has undertaken its solemn duties, acting swiftly both in response to the case brought by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention and in response to the General Assembly's request for advisory opinion, which we hope will be a true turning point in the quest for accountability and for justice for the Palestinian people. When will the Security Council finally undertake its solemn duties? When will the Council act to demand the ceasefire that has been demanded by the rest of the international community majority for months now? The veto of this draft resolution is not only regrettable after weeks of consultations with every single Council member and after endless patience by the State of Palestine, the Arab states, and nearly the entire international community that for months have demanded a ceasefire. It is absolutely reckless and dangerous against shielding Israel even as it commits the most shocking crimes while exposing millions of innocent Palestinian civilians to its wrath and more untold horrors. It is not Israel that should be protected by the veto. It is Palestinian children, women, and men who must be protected by this Council acting now. Only with a ceasefire can we give a chance for life, for Resolution 2712 and 2720 to be implemented, as the President of the Security Council has indicated correctly. Ceasefire would allow these two resolutions to be implemented for humanitarian assistance to reach the millions of desperate people in need, for UNRWA and other UN agencies to deliver life-saving aid, and a chance for our collective efforts to chart a path for justice and peace. And as long as the Council fails to demand a ceasefire, it will be considered not only derelict in its duties, but an enabler of the most horrific crimes we are witnessing in these days in Gaza. The message given today to Israel with this veto is that it can continue to get away with murder. Israel cannot and should not and will not get away with it. We will not allow it. This veto does not absolve Israel of its obligations, nor of those who shield it. Not here in the Security Council, not in the ICJ, and not anywhere. Even if the Security Council continues to shirk its responsibilities, to be obstructed by the veto of a permanent member over and over, the other organs of the international system are upholding their responsibilities. And one day or another, Palestinian children will not be viewed as a demography threat, but as children with a right to life and to fulfill their hopes and dreams. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Since October 7th, this Council has voted upon numerous resolutions constructed around the same flawed theme, the concept of a ceasefire. This word is constantly mentioned in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and by UN officials and agencies, as if it is a silver bullet, a magical solution to all of the region's problems. For the past 137 days, the only solution discussed on the international stage is this absurd notion of a ceasefire. Will a ceasefire bring home the hostages? Will a ceasefire eliminate Hamas? Will a ceasefire disarm Hezbollah, the Houthis, and all the other Iranian terrorist proxies in our region? Will a ceasefire end the genocidal ambitions of Palestinian terror groups aiming for Israel's annihilation? We're still waiting for President Abbas to condemn the October 7th massacre. What exactly will this silver bullet ceasefire achieve? A ceasefire achieves one thing and one thing only: the survival of Hamas. Exactly the opposite of how it's portrayed. A ceasefire is a death sentence for many more Israelis and Gazans. Supporting a ceasefire means supporting the survival of jihadist terrorists that will continue butchering Israelis and endlessly spilling the blood of innocents. There is a reason, dear colleagues, that the ICJ unanimously and rightly rejected South Africa's attempt to undermine Israel's right to defend itself by calling for a ceasefire. The very idea that Israel would be denied this fundamental right while Hamas would be free to continue its terror and hold hostages is morally unthinkable, because as you know, Hamas is not going to even read your resolutions. So why are some on this council so determined to impose harmful measures that the ICJ refused to take? You all know the answers. Colleagues, a ceasefire is the epitome of a kick-the-can-down-the-road policy. A ceasefire today means immunity for baby killers and rapists. It's an easy way to make this problem an issue for another day. With a ceasefire in place, Hamas will regroup, rearm, and their next attempted genocide against Israelis will only be a question of when, not if. Hamas has sworn publicly to commit the atrocities of October 7th again and again and again until Israel is annihilated. So why is the Council, charged with security, is so fixated on aiding these monsters to stay in power? Just yesterday, Israel exposed footage proving that Shiri Bibas and her two children, 4-year-old Ariel and 1-year-old Kfir, were taken to Gaza alive. So tell me, distinguished council members, a 4-year-old and a baby were taken hostage by Hamas, among others, and most of you choose to support a ceasefire? Why do you want to leave them in Gaza? Do you not see how immoral that is? And what kind of precedent this would set for terrorists around the globe? Did you think about baby Kfir when you voted on this resolution? A resolution that would ensure that Kfir, along with 133 other hostages, remain in dark terror tunnels? Did you think about Noa Argamani? Noa's look of sheer horror as she violently separated from her boyfriend Avinoam Or and taken to Gaza on the back of a motorbike has become a symbol of the hostages' plight. In the heart-wrenching video, you can hear Noa screaming and pleading with the terrorists not to abduct her. Noa's mother, Liora, born Chong Hong Lee, a Chinese-Israeli citizen originally from Wuhan, is terminally ill with stage 4 brain cancer. All she asks is that she can hug Noa, her only daughter, one last time before she succumbs to her illness. To my Chinese colleague, I ask you, in the name of Liora Chong Hong Lee, rather than pushing for a harmful ceasefire which will keep Noa in Gaza, I urge you, pressure Hamas to release Noa so that her mother can see Noa one last time before her death. Colleagues, jihadists around the globe see that the body mandated to uphold international security is willing to allow murderous Hamas rapists to continue their reign of terror. Your calls for a ceasefire empower Hamas, giving them hope to stay in power. This does not ensure security, it prevents it. You truly want a ceasefire? Well, Israel also wants a ceasefire. Your children are not the ones that are falling in battle against bloodthirsty terrorists. They are ours. If Hamas survives, it will be our children that Hamas will murder in cold blood again. Israel seeks a ceasefire, but there is only one formula that we are willing to accept. All of our hostages must be released, and Hamas must turn themselves in. Colleagues, the Algerian resolution not only empowers jihadists by calling for a ceasefire, it also fails, again, to condemn Hamas for their heinous crimes. Not condemning Hamas's atrocities has now become a tradition here. It's tragic. Hamas Nazis invaded Israel, deliberately murdering families, raping women and girls, and destroying everything they could get their hands on. They are brutal terrorists who took pride in their barbarism. Yet, not once, not even once, since October 7th, has this Council or any UN body condemned Hamas and their violence. One day, we mentioned history here, when historians studied the reasons why the UN lost its standing and influence, the inability of this organization to condemn terrorists that slaughter children will be one of the driving factors. Mark my words. But the impact of this Council's decisions spread much further than this room. If this Council is incapable of condemning Hamas, UN officials feel like they have further legitimacy to whitewash Hamas. Mere days ago, Under-Secretary General Griffith stated that Hamas is not a terrorist group, but a political movement. Is the intentional, brutal murder of hundreds of civilians not terror? Is the systematic rape of women not terror? Is beheading and burning children alive not terror? We all know Hamas is a terrorist organization, yet by staying silent in the face of Hamas's crimes and not condemning them, you allow such lies to perpetuate. Your politicized decision of silence promotes the falsehoods that Hamas can be reasoned with, that they are not the bloodthirsty terrorists that they are. And this is the stance that the UN adopts and promotes. Condemn Hamas as a council, condemn their atrocities, rid this institution of its shame. Do it for the sake of those butchered, for the sake of the hostages, for the sake of morality and truth. It's in your hands. Colleagues, some of you have approached me and asked me why Israel is so critical of the UN and its agencies. The recent event over the past weeks have hopefully made it clearer to you. 1 week ago, Special Rapporteur Albanese libelously stated that the victims of October 7th were not murdered for their identity, but in response to Israel's so-called oppression. This is victim blaming and a clear justification of terror. But for some UN employees, even poisonous words are not enough. Dozens of UNRWA employees took active roles in the October 7th massacre, while many more praised the savage attack. Faisal Ali Musallem El-Naami, an UNRWA social worker, stuffed the body of Jonathan Samerano into a truck to be taken to Gaza. A Hamas data center was located directly underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, connected to UNRWA's power supply, and terror tunnels have been found running underneath various UNRWA facilities, schools, everything. Out of UNRWA's 1,300 employees in Gaza, 12%, I repeat, 12% are members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and at least 236 of them are active terrorists in these organizations' armed wings. UNRWA has been proven to be an instrumental part of Hamas's terror machine, which makes UNRWA itself a terrorist organization. Yet, rather than take responsibility for the weaponization of this murderous UN agency, Commissioner General Lazzarini has chosen to say that he had no knowledge of Hamas's hold on his own agency. This is blatantly false. Israel exposed terror tunnels under UNRWA schools and supplied evidence of Hamas's exploitation of UNRWA. You can see it in my Twitter account. I personally sent letters to the Commissioner General and the Secretary General. We implored them for years to carry out a comprehensive search of all UNRWA facilities in Gaza. Yet not only did they refuse, they chose to bury their heads in the sand and ignore the reality. This is why every report, every statement or number provided by the UN cannot be trusted. In Gaza, dear colleagues, Hamas is the UN and the UN is Hamas. Distinguished Council members, this ostrich tactic, burying one's head in the sand, is the modus operandi among UN leadership. Yet, no matter how deep one's head is buried, it will not change the reality on the ground. A terrorist is a terrorist. A terror organization is a terror organization. And a law-abiding liberal democracy will remain as such. Even if here at the UN, for political reasons, light becomes darkness and day becomes night. This is also the case with the escalating situation on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. For years, and you heard it here, for years Israel has called for this Council to impose the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. Yet, for years, the UN has opted for the ostrich tactic. Tragically, this is no longer a situation that can be ignored. The clock is ticking. It is not a matter of years, but weeks before Israel will be forced to implement Resolution 1701 ourselves. Just yesterday, a Hezbollah drone was downed while flying over the Sea of Galilee, deep, deep inside Israel. Over 2,000 Hezbollah missiles and rockets have rained down on the cities of Israel's north. 2,000. And nearly 100,000 residents of northern Israel have been displaced due to the threat posed by Hezbollah, with, of course, Iran's backing. A ceasefire in Gaza is not only destructive for Israel and the Palestinians, it also ensures that a blind eye is turned to what is unfolding in the rest of the region. Be it the Houthis' relentless attacks on maritime trade, pro-Iran militias targeting even American service members, or Hezbollah's constant bombardment of Israel's north. The clock is ticking, and sadly, we will be forced to take decisive action. Terror will never be tolerated. Madam President, this Council must put politics aside for the sake of its mandate. A ceasefire that allows Hamas to remain in power means ensured death and destruction. Ignoring Hamas's atrocities and not condemning them means empowering terrorists worldwide. And focusing only on Gaza while looking away from the terror aggression across the region will lead to a future that none of us seek. The Security Council must fulfill its mandate. It must side with Israel against the forces of evil, and it must face reality. Reality is not found when one's head is buried in the sand. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. I shall now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس. أود أن أهنئ بلدكم الصديق على رئاسة المجلس، ويسرني أن أدلي بهذا البيان باسم دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية، وهي بلادي دولة قطر والمملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الكويت ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة وسلطنة عمان ومملكة البحرين، وننضم للبيان الذي ستدلي به المجموعة العربية بعد قليل. السيد الرئيس، ينعقد اجتماعنا اليوم في ظل ظروف بالغة الخطورة، حيث تحول الوضع في قطاع غزة إلى أسوأ كارثة إنسانية يشهدها العالم. فبحسب التقارير الأممية ليس في قطاع غزة مكان آمن، وأصبح تقريبا كل سكانه الذي يتجاوز عددهم مليوني شخص من النازحين والمعرضين للمهاجرة. إن دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية وفي ظل اقتراب عدوان احتلال إسرائيل ضد الأشقاء الفلسطينيين في قطاع غزة من الشهر الخامس، تحذر وبشدة من ازدياد وتيرة الهجمات العسكرية
ongoing for 5 months. The GCC has cautioned against the increased frequency of military attacks against our Palestinian brothers. We caution against the increased number of victims, the majority of whom are women and children who have been killed, wounded, and people under rubble. We call on the United Nations to assume responsibility. The UN officials have said that they've never seen a situation such as that taking place today. The UN Secretary General invoked Article 99 of the Charter, warned about the dangers of the collapse of the humanitarian system and of public order in Gaza. He also called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. There's a need to fully implement the resolutions 2720 and 2712, the Security Council dating 2022. Madam President, the Arab states of the Gulf Cooperation Council condemn in the firmest terms the Israeli threat regarding the launch of a military operation against the city of Rafah. In the city of Gaza, we caution against the fact that these threats portend an increase in violence levels and destabilization. These threats represent a danger to regional stability. We firmly condemn the attempts at forced displacement of civilians, and we firmly reject any military engagement in the city of Rafah. We caution against the new humanitarian disaster in that area. This is the last refuge for hundreds of thousands of displaced persons in the Gaza Strip.
حيال تعليق بعض الدول المانحة تمويلها لوكالة الأنروا وخاصة في ظل الأوضاع الإنسانية الخطيرة الراهنة حيث يعتمد على الوكالة 5 ملايين من الفلسطينيين لا سيما في قطاع غزة. وفي هذا الصدد نضم صوتنا للأمين العام في مناشدته بالدول التي علقت دعمها للأنروا بمراجعة قراراتها واستئناف تمويلها للوكالة وذلك حتى لا تتعمق الكارثة الإنسانية الحالية في غزة أكثر مما هي عليه وتجدد دولنا موقفها الثابت بالعدالة القوية
worsening. Our countries reiterate their steadfast position in support of the just Palestinian cause and the legitimate rights of the fraternal people to establish an independent state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. Madam President, Arab states of the GCC extend their appreciation for the ongoing negotiations around a framework agreement for a new humanitarian truce in Gaza. My country, the state of Qatar, has been facilitating these efforts alongside the Arab Republic of Egypt and the U.S. to free hostages and detainees to guarantee greater deliveries of humanitarian assistance and to rescue efforts in Gaza to protect civilians. The Arab states of the GCC have profound regrets regarding the failure of the Council to adopt the draft resolution submitted by Algeria. This was supported by the Arab group and the overwhelming majority of members of the Council. This draft is humanitarian by its content and aligns with IHL. We wish to emphasize in this regard that our country will continue efforts alongside partners at all levels to guarantee the achievement of an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Let us end the bloodletting of the Palestinian people and let us deliver adequate volumes of humanitarian assistance and relief to Gaza and let us protect civilians. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the representative of Qatar for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you, Madam President.
أتشرف بإلقاء هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية وأود في البداية أن أهنئكم وبلدكم غيانا على تولي رئاسة المجلس لهذا الشهر وأعرب لكم عن الشكر لعقد هذه الجلسة ونتقدم بالشكر إلى الجزائر العضو العربي في المجلس على مبادرتها بتقديم مشروع القرار ومساعيها طوال مسار المفاوضات من أجل الحفاظ على وحدة المجلس والتوصل إلى توافق حول مطلب وقف إطلاق النار الفوري لأسباب إنسانية لا تخطئها العين وباعتباره الإجراء الأكثر إلحاحاً في ظل الأوضاع الكارثية التي تردى فيها قطاع غزة والمعاناة الإنسانية الرهيبة للسكان الفلسطينيين نتيجة مواصلة سلطات الاحتلال لعدوانها وجرائم الحرب والإبادة الجماعية التي تقترفها في حق الشعب الفلسطيني بلا هوادة علاوة على إمعانها في إجراءات العقاب الجماعي ومنع المساعدة الإنسانية والطبية والغذاء والماء والوقود وكل وسائل الحياة. السيدة الرئيسة،
تتوجه المجموعة العربية بالشكر للدول الأعضاء في مجلس الأمن التي ساهمت بكل إيجابية وبشكل بناء في مسار المفاوضات بخصوص مشروع القرار وصوتت لفائدته، وبقدر ما تعرب عن أسفها لفشل المجلس في اعتماد مشروع القرار وعجزه مرة أخرى عن الاضطلاع بمسؤوليته القانونية والأخلاقية باعتباره الجهاز الرئيسي المسؤول عن حفظ الأمن والسلم الدوليين، فإنها تجدد تأكيد تمسكها كما العديد من دول العالم وأعضاء مجلس الأمن والمنظمات الإنسانية والأممية بضرورة إقرار وقف فوري لإطلاق النار ومنع تنفيذ سلطات الاحتلال لمخططها الذي يستهدف أكثر من 1.5 مليون فلسطيني في رفح، ومنع تكرار جرائم التهجير القسري للفلسطينيين وإفراغ الأرض الفلسطينية من سكانها. وتعتبر المجموعة العربية أنه من غير المقبول بكل المقاييس أن يظل مجلس الأمن مرتهنا للحسابات السياسية والمصالح الضيقة في حين تتواصل الاعتداءات اليومية على الشعب الفلسطيني وتتعمق معاناته ويفقد الآلاف من أبنائه بمن فيهم الأطفال وكبار السن والنساء والمرضى. إن عجز مجلس الأمن اليوم عن التكلم بصوت واحد وإعلاء مبادئ القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني والحق في الحياة يوجه مرة أخرى الرسالة الخاطئة للقوة القائمة بالاحتلال ويطلق يدها لتواصل جرائمها واستهتارها بالشرعية الدولية واعتبار نفسها فوق القانون والمساءلة، كما يعمق أزمة الثقة في مصداقية هذا الجهاز الأممي الهام. وفي هذا السياق تجدد المجموعة العربية رفضها لسياسات الانحياز لمخططات سلطات الاحتلال وتوفير الحماية لها على حساب أرواح الآلاف من الفلسطينيين التي تزحف وأرضه التي تسرق عن طريق مخططات التهجير والاستيطان. وتؤكد المجموعة العربية رفضها لازدواجية المعايير التي ساهمت في إطالة أمد القضية الفلسطينية وفي عدم تنفيذ أي من القرارات الخاصة بها بكل ما رافق ذلك من مجازر وتنكيل في حق الشعب الفلسطيني وانتهاكات لحقوقه، وهي تطالب بالتعاطي مع كل القضايا والوضعيات بنفس المقاييس ودرجة الالتزام. كما تطالب المجموعة العربية المجتمع الدولي ومجلس الأمن بضمان توفير الحماية للفلسطينيين وتسريع دخول وإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية دون إعاقة إلى قطاع غزة، تنفيذا لقراري مجلس الأمن 2712 و 2720، كما تؤكد على دعمها الكامل لجهود كبيرة منسق الأمم المتحدة للشؤون الإنسانية وإعادة الإعمار في غزة سيغريد كات ومساعيها للاستجابة للحالة الإنسانية الكارثية التي يشهدها القطاع. السيد الرئيس، إن الجهود الجارية للتوصل إلى اتفاق إطار لتبادل الأسرى والمحتجزين وإقرار هدنة لا تتعارض مع مطلب الوقف الفوري لإطلاق النار الذي لا يمكن إلا أن يساعد على تسهيل مثل هذه المساعي. ولا تفسير للإصرار على رفض اعتماد مشروع القرار الخاص بهذا المطلب وتمكين المجموعة الدولية ومجلس الأمن من التكلم بصوت واحد إلا سعي حكومة الاحتلال لمواصلة عملياتها العسكرية وتنفيذ مخططها الرامي إلى تهجير الفلسطينيين من أرضهم. ومن هذا المنطلق وإزاء هذا التوجه الذي يهدف إلى تحييد مجلس الأمن ومنعه من تحمل مسؤوليته التي يقرها ميثاق الأمم المتحدة في مثل هذه الأوضاع الكارثية، فإننا نتساءل عن محددات دور المجلس ومتى سيسمح له بالقيام بهذا الدور المفترض، وكم من روح بريئة يجب أن تزهق قبل أن يتحقق ذلك. ألا يكفي قتل أكثر من 28,000 وجرح حوالي 70,000 وتهجير أكثر من 1.3 مليون وتدمير كل البنى التحتية والمساكن والمستشفيات والمدارس ودور العبادة ومكاتب الأمم المتحدة وقتل العشرات من موظفي الوكالات الأممية والإنسانية والصحفيين. السيد الرئيس، كذلك تدين المجموعة العربية بأشد العبارات اعتداءات السلطة القائمة بالاحتلال المتكرر على أراضي كل من سوريا ولبنان وخرقها لسيادتهما وقتلها للمدنيين الأبرياء وهو ما يقوض الأمن والسلم والاستقرار في المنطقة والعالم. ستواصل المجموعة العربية تحركاتها على جميع المستويات وفي كافة المحافل لتتحمل المجموعة الدولية مسؤوليتها بعيدا عن الانتقائية والحسابات السياسية ولتفرض على سلطات الاحتلال احترام القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني وتضع حدا لمخططاتها وانتهاكاتها الجسيمة بحق الشعب الفلسطيني. شكرا.
of the rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Madam President.
Of Tunisia for his statement. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Egypt to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة. السادة الأعضاء، لقد شهدنا صباح اليوم مجددا نموذجا صارخا من ازدواج المعايير وقد عاقب الوفد الأمريكي للمرة الثالثة محاولة استصدار قرار من مجلس الأمن لإيقاف وقف إطلاق النار في غزة رغم تصويت 13 عضوا من مجلس الأمن لصالح مشروع القرار الجزائري المقدم بدعم كامل من المجموعتين العربية والإسلامية في الأمم المتحدة.
by the Arab and Islamic groups in the United Nations.
للجزائر العضو العربي بمجلس الأمن على تقديم القرار
for Algeria, the Arab member of the
Security Council for
putting forward the draft resolution. We are grateful for all those who voted in favor of the draft resolution.
المزيد من الإحباط وخيبة الأمل إزاء استمرار عرقلة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لمساعي وقف إطلاق النار عبر اطلاع الجهاز الرئيسي المنوط به حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين بواجباته. سادة الأعضاء، أين يقف هذا التصويت الأمريكي إزاء المعاناة الإنسانية التي وصلت لحد الكارثة؟
Where would this U.S. vote stand in the face of the humanitarian suffering that reached the catastrophe level after the 20th week of the war in Gaza? How can we call for a rules-based international order while when we call for the implementation of these rules, we are met only with deaf ears? When the Secretary General of the UN invoked Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations,
أليس القرار الصادر من محكمة العدل الدولية والذي طلب اتخاذ إجراءات محددة لكاشف الحاجة الفورية لوقف إطلاق النار؟ أليست تقارير مكتب تنسيق الشؤون الإنسانية ومنظمة الصحة العالمية والأونروا وما تعكسه بشأن كارثية الوضع الإنساني الراهن في غزة ولا سيما على الحدود مع مصر في رفح بكافية لتقنع الوفد الأمريكي بالتصويت لصالح وقف إطلاق النار بعد مرور 140 يوما على بدء النزاع وبعد أن فقد أكثر من 30,000 إنسان أغلبهم من النساء والأطفال حياتهم جراء الحرب الجائرة في غزة. سادة الأعضاء، مصر هي أول من أقام السلام مع إسرائيل من الدول العربية، ومصر هي أحرص الدول على استقرار منطقة الشرق الأوسط. وبينما يتواصل إخفاق المجلس الأمن في إيقاف الحرب، ستستمر مصر في تحمل العبء الأكبر سياسيا وأمنيا وإنسانيا جراء ولكنها ملتزمة بالعمل المضني والمتواصل على كافة الأصعدة لإيقاف نزيف الدماء، لإيقاف الحرب المدمرة، لاستعادة الأفق السياسي، لتحقيق آمال الشعبين الفلسطيني والإسرائيلي في الأمن والاستقرار وفقا لقرارات الشرعية الدولية وإنشاء الدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة على خطوط الرابع من يونيو 1967 وعاصمتها. سيدة الرئيسة، مصر تتفاوض وتتوسط بمنتهى الجدية بالتنسيق مع كل من الولايات المتحدة وقطر وإسرائيل والجانب الفلسطيني لسرعة إطلاق المحتجزين والرهائن والأسرى الفلسطينيين
the
وسرعة دفع المساعدات الإنسانية بأقصى سرعة
and to deliver humanitarian aid at scale, to put an end to the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza,
الأشقاء الفلسطينيين من الحصار
to
الجائر
save the Palestinian brothers from the unjust siege imposed on them by the Israeli occupying power, and to stand in the face of all attempts by Israel to impose forced displacement on the Palestinian people to liquidate the Palestinian cause. Egypt calls on the Security Council and all responsible international powers to save the choice for peace by immediate implementation of ceasefire. This will not impede the ongoing mediation efforts, but rather will create the conducive conditions for its success. Let us negotiate and mediate in an environment of smooth flow of humanitarian aid and restored calm and healing the wounds of the wounded, instead of negotiating and mediating in an atmosphere of war and destruction caused by the destructive Israeli war machine. Madam President, Egypt's call for all of you is plain and simple. Cease fire now. Let's not mistake this noble and direct message as anything as having political calculations. It aims only at saving the civilians. Egypt warns once again against the catastrophic risks looming against the Palestinian people as a result of the declared plans of Israel to have ground offensive in Rafah. And we warn the international community of the consequences of this destructive war.
I thank the representative of Egypt for his statement. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I now give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President.
刚才以色
Earlier,
列代表对
we
中国
heard
代
the
表团
representative
提出了一个问题，
Israel raising a question to the
我
Chinese
们要回答
delegation.
你的是，
In response, we'd like to
每一
say
个生命都
every
是宝
life
贵的，
is precious.
都有权利得
Every
到保
life
护。
has the right to be protected.
Final number, and we got needed humanitarian assistance in. And we're continuing to work on this. This is not a change. It is not. It reflects what we've been doing all along. It hasn't changed what we've been doing.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. First, you have been saying that the Security Council, that you are not agreeing to the resolution under, different reasons, but among others that the Security Council doesn't condemn Hamas. But as a matter of fact, on October 18th, it was the U.S. that vetoed a resolution that condemned Hamas. This is one thing. The second thing, I think a lot of Palestinians ask the question, what is the line? When is enough Palestinian? There have been more than 29 Palestinian civilians who were killed, majority of whom women and children, and people are asking how many deaths are enough for the U.S. to stop delivering weapons and to call for a ceasefire immediately for humanitarian reasons. Thank you.
In answer to your first question, there were a number of other issues with that resolution. It did call for a condemnation of Hamas. It did not recognize Israel's right to self-defense, which is a right that Israel has. And there were other issues with that particular resolution. Since that time, we still have not gotten condemnation of Hamas, despite the fact that I think it is, every council member, almost every council member will say that in their statements. We think it should be reflected in a resolution, even a humanitarian resolution. And let me just say, every life matters. And so it is important that we find a solution that will stop the killing and deaths and suffering of the Palestinian people. And that's why we're on the ground 24/7. No one else is putting their people out there. No one else is putting skin and boots on the ground to find a solution to this situation. And we'll keep working on that every single day.
Hi, Ambassador. China described your position that the Algerian draft would undermine regional efforts at the hostage deal as completely untenable given the situation on the ground. Explain then, Ambassador, how the Algerian draft would have placed those talks in jeopardy, given that the Algerian text also called for the immediate release of those hostages.
Yes, but they also call for an immediate ceasefire, which would give Hamas the cover of not releasing the hostage. Part of the ceasefire that we're working on requires that they do exactly that, and this resolution did not make that connection. And it was our concern that it would send the wrong message to Hamas, that this resolution, which actually gives them something that they have asked for without requiring them to do something in return, would have meant that the fighting would have continued, because without the hostage releases, we know that the fighting is going to continue.